O.G. Rose, and today we'll be talking about understanding gaps to reasoning on edges, a broad overview of Hegelian moves of thought. This was inspired by the Net 49 and is meant to be an outline, a map that's sort of suggesting some of the main, moves of thought that I think we can find in Hegel, so that when we encounter other ideas in Hegel or other papers about Hegel, we have kind of a hook to hang our hat on, so that we can kind of keep our thought in place or make it a bit easier to give our thought a form. And to start, I think we can see Hegel as trying to articulate a philosophy where he shows that most of thought has had a logic to negation, or a logic to the loss of immediacy. Like, I become logical about this bookcase, and then I translate the bookcase into an abstraction about the bookcase, and then I reason from there. So there's a logic to negation, if you will. And rather we accept Hegel's interpretation of Kant or not, we can see Kant as a supreme example of a logic to negation. Famously with the noumenon, we can only reach phenomenon, we can't reach things in themselves, we can reason to a certain line, and that's it. Logic eventually reaches the point where logic can go no further. No matter how hard you try, you can never get to the thing itself. So you have the logic to negation. This is in the realm of understanding for Hegel. And for Hegel, he doesn't deny any of that, but he says, well, how do we be logical about the fact that logic always translates immediacy outside of itself? And for me, this is the movement of logic to negation, and then it will be the logic on negation. And another way to put that is we have logic that leads us to the place where we understand that we negate immediacy, and then we have logic that is also aware that logic negates immediacy. How do you be logical if you know that logic is precisely an understanding of things in terms that they are not? How do you be logical using logic when you know that logic is an abstraction? Now, that doesn't mean it's wrong, that doesn't mean it's bad, but the moment I talk about a bookcase or a cat or Daniel, I'm talking about a moment. I'm talking about a moment in a movement of becoming. And so I'm solidifying and freezing a phenomenon into a frame of its existence that does not capture the whole. Even if it suggests the whole or it has some sort of participation in the whole, I certainly cannot reduce the bookcase to this moment of it. And yet if I'm going to be logical about it, what else can I be logical about it but this moment? And a way to think about that is, Hegel makes a point to say how much he honors and appreciates Aristotle. But A is A thinking would basically be a logic that follows from a moment of a phenomenon. And it can be useful and it can be accurate, but it can't be complete. What does it mean to be logical, knowing that logic is always losing its subject? The thing that we are trying to be logical about is never the thing itself. And how do you be logical about that? Well, that's going to change everything, and this is where Hegel at the beginning of the Science of Logic says that logic needs to update after 2,000 years, and a way to think of that update is a movement from a logic to negation to a logic on negation. Now, the funny move that happens here is that if we, through understanding, lead logic to the place where logic transforms the terms of logic from AA to AB, which is to say that we understand that logic following Aristotle was one-sided, and that it would capture moments of things but not becomings. It would try to articulate being, but pure being is nothing, and that's a movement of becoming. And also, as we'll get into in Hegel, the very thought of a thing can change what the thing is. And we have to be logical about that if we're going to be truly logical. Well, this would suggest that logic reaches a place where it negates the terms by which logic is defined. So suddenly it's as if logic never occurred. And what came up in the Net 49 is the idea that of the logic of exchange that Javier talks about, and we can actually exchange, trade out, change out the very logic of exchange itself, and thus make, the character of exchange change. Where we can say that we tend to think that an exchange is something where if I do A, I receive B. But what if I were to think that an exchange is simply something where I give myself and don't expect anything in return? Well, then I exchange the terms of exchange. And so in Hegel, logic reaches a place where it changes the very terms of logic, and it's thus as if logic never even started. And this is what's very strange. Like, once logic reaches a place where it negates itself, is as if logic didn't reach the place where it negated itself, because the very terms by which logic are logic never were reached. So it wasn't logic that was ever in operation. And how do we be logical about that? What does it mean that logic has to work itself through history and intentionally work through error until understanding exhausts itself, or saturates itself, to use Mr. Ebert's language, to where it realizes that it can't be the complete picture? And thus, it's as if logic has never even begun. And that's the weird move here in Hegel. Like, if logic in Hegel has reached a place where logic realizes that the terms of logic were wrong, then it's as if logic never began. And yet we needed the errors of logic, the mistakes of logic, the incompleteness of logic to reach this point where we can realize that logic was incomplete. So we really can't say they were mistakes, can we? Can we really say they were errors if they were necessary to get to this place where we can negate, sublate logic into new terms and thus make it seem like logic never began? How do we be logical about necessary error? And this is another example of where we need to update our thinking about logic, because we tend to think that we are logical to the degree that we avoid error. But what is suggested here is that error is necessary for us to be logical. So what is logic? And it should be noted before expanding on what I mean by all that, is that if the very act of thinking about a tree as a tree changes the phenomenon into an abstraction, which then changes how I relate to the phenomenon in the world, well then logic abstracts phenomenon from themselves to understand them. And then Hegel's idea is that that very abstraction then changes the world. It changes how the world unfolds. And so the very idea that we have about logic thus changes how the world unfolds to make it seem like that idea is correct. And yet it might not be, and it might be wrong. Like Hegel's whole point is that traditional logic was not correct or was not complete, and yet it still changed the world. How could that be possible? And how do we be logical about that very case? How do we be logical knowing that what we think changes the world? Because then the very basis by which you would determine logic from illogical could be changing right from under you, right? So then how do you be logical? Unless logic is found in the very creative unfolding of that set as a whole. Unless logic is the very piloting of the nature notion dialectical monism that I think ultimately defines Hegel's metaphysics. But that will require the entire absolute choice to explain. Now, to go back to what we're saying about error seeming necessary for the advancement of thought, the example that came up in the Net 49 was the whole parts debate. There's a lot of people now in emergentism, John Vervaeke, and a lot of other different people who will say, and Wolfgang Smith, who will say that parts contain their wholes and wholes contain their parts. You can't really make that division. Everything is more like a symphony orchestra. And that we need to think in terms of emergentism. Well, what's interesting is that the very idea of emergentism makes sense to us precisely because I can talk about wholes and parts, and people who hear me talk about wholes and parts know what I'm saying, and yet those terms can't be right. And yet for us to make sense of emergentism, we require the history of the thinking about wholes and parts that cannot be right so that we can make sense of the concept of emergentism and why it means anything. Like, if you didn't have the whole history of the debate with wholes and parts, or those languages, or that language, then I couldn't say that was wrong and that wrongness mean anything. Like, it means something to you when I say that there are no wholes and parts, because you know what wholes and parts mean. You know what they are. And so I can say to you, and it means something, there are no wholes and parts. That's this weird, contradictory, negative move. It is because of a history of an error that then saying that history was an error means something. And then that meaning changes how we act in the world and what we think about today, which changes how history unfolds and changes the kind of subjects we are, and so on and so forth. The concept of emergentism is changing the world. And yet that concept has meaning to change the world because of a history of erroneous thought. So, was that thought erroneous? Is the word erroneous correct? How do we be logical knowing that you need error to have meaning? That you need error to advance? What does it mean to be logical in that condition? What does it mean to be logical on the negation as opposed to the negation, and then you ignore the negation as opposed to see it as somehow essential to the development of thought itself? All this can suggest why in Hegel the fear of error is the fear of truth. It would seem as if error can have a role to make truth meaningful. And it's a little more speculative, but I think we can understand what the word God means for Hegel in this context, for it's as if God is the ultimate example of a concept like emergentism. Imagine the word emergentism showed up in human history around 2000 BC, and imagine that humanity retained and never forgot the word. Imagine we kept coming back to it, imagine we kept redefining it, and so on. It wouldn't be until now, after centuries of parts and wholes thinking, that we could properly better understand the term emergentism, which was always with us. We would have received the term far too early, and yet, because we received that term, we then acted in a manner to bring ourselves to the place where we could understand it. Well, it seems that that's kind of what's happened with the word God, or the concept of God. We received a word at the start of history that we needed, the failure of history to grasp, and grasp again, and grasp again. Perhaps it is only because we received the word God too early, though, that we thought about and explored reality in a manner that would help us realize through failure the meaning of God. So we cannot say that the receiving of the word God too early was a mistake. Too early is a contingent and even poetic phrase. But the point is that God is a term that represents our most profound understanding about ourselves and our cosmos, that gains meaning through failure to know what we are talking about when we talk about God, as it must, so that we indeed go through the process necessary for the term to have gained meaning. All of history, then, can be seen as a long process of failing to understand God, which is to say history is a testament of our fallenness that is also the condition of our possible sublation. God is the X variable all of history has failed to say, but this very failure has been needed so that when we say this X variable and re-say it, it is meaningful, and every failure makes it more so thus. So history is a story of failing to say the word God, and that failure is necessary so that the term God has meaning and greater meaning and greater meaning and greater meaning. And so the term God is the ultimate example of that. And then if we go to, this idea of Geist marching through history as God, as the Spirit of God, then perhaps we can think of it like this in the terms that were so put out. Now, to this point, and this also came up in the Net 49, as there seems to be a difference between silence that results from a failure of words and silence that is a result of from there never being speaking, so there seems to be a difference between failure or the inability to say the name of God from a lack of trying, and then the inability to say the name of God from failure. And this gets into Heidegger's Nilation, clearing, and Hegel's negation. And these ideas in mind, you can say there's a difference between staying at home and returning to home, and return is big in Hegel. In the same way that there's a difference in quality between losing and never having, or giving up and never having. And in a certain quantitative sense, it's identical to never have and to lose, but in a qualitative sense, it's not the same at all. And in this way, we can see failure as what gives quality to the word God. Or in a Heideggerian sense, it is the nilation of being that gives quality to being. It is the clearing aside of lowercase b being that gives the quality to uppercase b being. And in the same way that it is negation in Hegel that gives quality to sublation, and it frankly makes possible the quality of sublation. With this quantitative-qualitative distinction in mind, we really, if I were to ask, it's kind of the difference between distance and depth. Like when you go somewhere, that's a quantitative change. And it, of course, can entail qualitative change as well. But if I were to say, how do you go deeper, or what is depth? Well, that seems to involve with what you already have. It's not really going anywhere, it's going inward. And that's it's almost like digging. Like quality is more like digging. And if depth is found here, and for Heidegger, being seems to be a matter of depth, and in Hegel, sublation seems to be a matter of depth very often. Well, depth is found here, like here, but what is here? That would require digging, and that seems to be an act of subtraction more than adding. Like distance seems to be going, adding experience, whereas depth seems to have a lot of negation and nilation and clearing aside. Perhaps we can think of negation and nilation as acts of metaphysical and philosophical digging. To look where we are, we must either go up or go down, and it would seem only gods can fly, which in this metaphor example would be to create ex nihilo. Thus, as finite humans, our only option is to dig, or to nihilo. You could certainly create depth if you could create out of nothing, like God, but humans don't seem like we can do that. So the only other way to get depth, qualitative change, would be some sort of nilation, some sort of negation. This suggests all the clearing and moving aside language of Heidegger. And it does seem like being, capital B, comes forth in clearing more so than something we find, which would be more quantitative. And I think it should be noted that, if we engage in negation and nilation, and something comes forth, there's some new quality of being, there's a higher probability that this is not mere subjectivity, because what were we doing as subjects? We were removing the subject. We were getting out of the way. We weren't seeking being or some new quality. It just came forth. Well, if it just came forth, all the more reason to think it's there, that it's actual. Maybe not, but there would be more epistemic justification for that step. In the same way that when you encounter the strike of beauty, as discussed in the paper by O.G. Rose on the strike of beauty, or on beauty, or the fate of beauty, that's entirely a suspension of yourself. And since it's such a suspension, there's reason to think that it's not merely subjective, that there's something there, if you will. And so likewise, if being comes forth in an act of negation or nilation, all the more reason to think it's there. And thus, if we can go into the Hegelian nature notion, and there's something creative about the human being in a very deep and ontological way, then perhaps we would, from a clearing experience, have reason to think that God makes room for us to create out of God, that being makes room for us to create out of being, and that God does so in and through a history we need to ever say the word God well, thanks to failure. In a way, what we could say is that a logic that never fails is not logical for Hegel, because logic must reach the place where it realizes that it always negates the immediacy it considers in its act of consideration. Logic always changes, and so logic must change how it thinks about itself, at which point it's as if logic never started or was used at all. Logic can't begin until it reaches the place where it feels like it never started, in the same way that the question of being can never be asked until being gets to the place where it realizes or feels like it never asked about being. There must be this kind of failure, and this failure then is the very thing that provides the quality of what we can encounter moving forward. The failure of logic then creates the quality of the new logic. And you can see in this a way in which truth is meaningless without error. Error is what we can leave behind so that the truth means true. But all of this kind of begs a strange question. How is it we start if we start somewhere false? How is it we think about the whole part? If now today we understand that wholes and parts are not really wholes and parts, how did we get here? How did we advance in thought? How did we use concepts that were false to get here? Shouldn't we have stopped? what is the substance then? There was something we were operating according to that felt correspondent. It didn't feel merely coherent. It felt correspondent with reality. So what's going on? How do we operate? What is happening? Well, it could be that to think about what we do when we think, we really do need to take the phenomenology of the artist seriously. The writer who starts a novel doesn't know everywhere he or she will end up, and yet does this mean we cannot trust the writer? Because we could start saying that we can't trust thought, right? And then, the term trust seems inappropriate here. What the writer does is beyond such language. At least it's not readily captured by it. The artist knows what he or she is doing and yet doesn't. The artist makes mistakes and yet all of those mistakes are necessary for the final product. The artist tinkers and yet suddenly and all at once the artist isn't tinkering but doing exactly what he or she intended all along. It's mysterious and then it's concrete. It does seem as if thought and logic are more like the thinking of a creator than someone seeking simple correspondence between idea and phenomenon. That doesn't mean correspondence is bad. It just seems that the mind is in a far more dynamic and creative business, and it's able to tinker and go with those ideas. Like, there are so many rough drafts of novels that a writer leaves behind, and yet that rough draft was necessary in part of the thinking, and then it gets incorporated into the final product in different ways. And it seems like the mind is more like a paintbrush than the magnifying glass of a Sherlock Holmes. It would seem as if thought needs error in the same way that the creative needs experimentation. Like, if you're going to be a writer, you're going to write a lot of crap. You're going to write a lot of drafts you throw away. You're going to write a bunch of lines you delete. And yet those lines you delete are intelligible to you. They're necessary for you. And it seems like thought is like that. Thought is a lot more creative. We are thinking creatively more so than we realize. We often think that thinking is merely an identification of what is there, but it's more like it's more like thinking is creating itself to get there. It's not so much that we are thinking what is there. Not that means we're not thinking something real. It's like we're thinking creatively. We're creating thought to get there. Thought is creating itself to get there. And that's what's going on. There's an act of creation occurring in thought of itself to get at its subject. And this is occurring in thought. It's much more alive. The paper alludes to another paper called Thinking Here and Thinking There. And a point that paper makes is that though we draw a very sharp distinction between thinking and dreaming, and I don't even deny that we need this distinction, but maybe that distinction should not be so hard. It is very possible that thinking and dreaming are more similar than we realize. I mean, when you dream, dreams are in colors, they're in shapes. They tend to consist of phenomenon in different ways that we've encountered. Like, the subjects of dreams and the subjects of thought are not that different. And what really is the difference? Like, when you are dreaming, like, what is the phenomenological difference of dreaming and thinking? Well, a dream feels like you can do anything, and thinking feels bound by reality. But, maybe we're just thinking that thought is bound by... if thought is unbound, like, this is the point. Like, if thought in general is unbound, just like dreams are unbound as much as unbound as possible without being chaos... I mean, dreams are not totally unbound. They're in color and shapes, right? But they're very unbound compared to what we're used to. Well, if thought is unbound, well, one, the variability, like, that means it can think it's distinct from dreaming because it's unbound. It's not bound to not bind itself. So because it's unbound, it can bind itself. It can think of itself as distinct from dreaming. And thought can even bind itself to conform to reality and believe it has no influence on reality and that that's all it is. Like, it would seem that the difference between dreaming and thinking is not really the mental acts themselves, but the context in which they are occurring. When you dream, you are asleep, so you're not bound by phenomenon. It's the same mental process, you're just not bound by phenomenon. But when you're awake... you're bound by phenomenon, but it's the context that's changed more than the mental act. And yes, I know we can get into left brain, right brain, hemisphere, Ian McKilker Quest, all the different people who talk about that, but ultimately we all agree that humans are a mixture of both of those. And so thinking is a mixture of both of those, and I would assume that dreaming is a mixture of both of those to some degree. It's probably more right brain than left brain, but I'd be amazed if there was no left brain. And so a day in the world is a mixture between right and left brain. And it really seems to be the context that's the main difference between dreaming and thinking, and so dreaming and logic. The mental acts themselves seem very, very similar. Now, to take this to the next level, I think it is suggested in Hegel that nature and notion are two sides of the same coin, that the very thinking of the human mind is isomorphic to reality itself, and that reality is isomorphic to mind, and that they inform each other in extraordinarily profound ways. It's not dualism, it's monism. They have the same substance, but they're also irreducible to one another and dialectically relating forever and ever. And then we get to speculatively reason what that means exactly. So if that's the case, then, thinking really is like dreaming. It's just more bound to time in the ways that the dreams of thinking manifest has to be in and through history. But I do think we need to, and hopefully other places in OG Rose make this clear, we need to be slower to think that thinking and dreaming are really that different. They may not be. And what does it mean to be logical if the act of logic is more dreamlike than we realize? Hard to say. Also, if logic is creative, and that the way we think about logic and define logic as logic is a creative act in itself, because we're determining the terms of logic, and if how we define logic changes how we act in the world, and thus changes how the world is manifest and unfolds, then logic is creative. And what this would really also then mean is that logic is a kind of edge of the universe. It's a creative edge. It's an unfolding. It's when we have a new conception of logic, then we, at that point on the planet, begin acting in a way that then changes how the world is, and that mode of being then spreads and spreads and spreads and spreads. And this is the movement from gaps to edges. And I think, though, we talk about there are certainly gaps in Hegel, like lack and gaps and incompleteness and these different things, Lacan, Zizek, and Goethe, and so on and so forth. But there's this move where the gap, what's a gap for understanding in reason, becomes an edge. It becomes an edge of the universe. It becomes an edge of how something unfolds, and it becomes creative. It's the limit. But that limit is alive and moving, and this was also suggested in how the absolute might move. The paper asks, are there gaps in The Lord of the Rings? Gaps, yeah. There's the gap between the words, between the reader and the author, the beginning and the end. There are all sorts of gaps in the fiction story, The Lord of the Rings. But those gaps are constitutive, they're constructive. If there was no gap between the beginning and end of the story, I couldn't enjoy it, or I couldn't be amazed by it, I couldn't be immersed in it. So the very gaps of The Lord of the Rings are not, it doesn't seem like they're gaps. Gaps metaphorically suggests I'm across a ravine and I'm on this side of it and I can't get to the other side. There's a gap. But that doesn't seem to be the language for The Lord of the Rings, and yet there are gaps. There are these kind of lacks, these kind of ontological lacks. And it would suggest that what ends up happening is you begin to read, in Hegel, understanding reaches the place where it realizes that gaps are the very possibility of its movement, and so those gaps are negated, sublated into edges. And by that I mean edges of the universe. Now, edges can cut you on a knife, right? Edges are dangerous, but edges are also creative. And when you're reading a book, there's an edge moving, and that's your location in the book, in the story. And as you move forward, that edge moves forward and it unfolds differently. So I think that what is a gap to understanding becomes an edge to reason. And that then becomes isomorphic to how the entire cosmos may unfold as nature notion, in concordance with notion, and thus how we think about it. And so reading a paper like this can change how we act in the world, and thus how the world unfolds. And so the movement of understanding gaps to reasoning about edges can change, or potentially in Hegel be an influence on the very edge of the universe ultimately, but only if we are willing to make that shift. And if thought is unbound, it doesn't have to. It can always think and imagine reasons not to, and so we have to make the choice. And so ultimately I do think that all of this will depend on a absolute choice. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so forth and so on, Amazon. And thank you so much for your time.